Good day, everyone. Welcome to Nampu. It's day 2, and welcome here to Nation and Conversation. It's great to have you in the audience, for those of you attending physically and for everyone watching on streaming online. Thank you very much for tuning into this discussion. We welcome you on behalf of Senves and our sponsors. Today's session specifically is on the energy crisis. I think we all have a very personal and direct understanding of the impact on South Africa and on the agricultural sector specifically. We're going to kick off with the discussion very shortly, but we've put together a bit of a scene setter video just so that we put the context together for you visually. So let's watch that now.
South Africa's energy crisis has considerably impacted the country's economy, with load shedding affecting food security, infrastructure, and community networks. In particular, it has had a significant adverse impact on agriculture. Increased production costs, reduced production, cold chain and supply chain disruptions, increased costs of basic primary foods, and shifts in commodity choices are all results of inconsistent power supply. To help put the crisis into perspective, we have to look at the current deficit. South Africa generates approximately 85% of its energy from coal. Eskom can generate up to 45,000 megawatts per hour. Still, it has been unable to supply on average 27,000 megawatts per hour, a deficit of 40%. And the lack of proper energy management has meant that no significant supply alternatives exist. During the Zuma administration, the renewable energy procurement program was completely halted with an eye on Russian nuclear solutions, which never materialized. This, in particular, has had a major impact on the country's current precarious position. So, what are some alternative solutions to the energy crisis?
Renewable energy is absolutely vital for the agricultural sector, both to reach our climate targets as well as, of course, to meet the energy gap. However, there needs to be a properly structured policy framework for that. We do know, of course, that with the restructuring of Eskom between distribution, transmission and generation, it will become a little bit more complicated. Whilst we believe there are many restrictions, unnecessary restrictions which might need to be removed, it still needs to be done in a coordinated manner.
It's probably going to remain important for businesses and individuals, for farmers, for small and medium scale enterprises to try and generate their own power as much as possible, because as we know, load shedding is probably going to be with us for the foreseeable future. There's been nice tax incentives, and from the CSR side, we're trying to encourage businesses to generate their own power via PV or other renewable energy sources. PV probably being the most viable and the easiest installable power resource. This will not only cushion them against load shedding, but it will also assist to save them money via the utility bill at the end of the month.
In South Africa, it's not only the recent energy crisis that is having a major impact on food inflation. So energy costs have increased globally. We see them coming down. That's spilling into our market gradually. So we see lower shipping rates, and that's a combination of supply and demand dynamics internationally. We see global commodity prices coming down rapidly. So that is also feeding into our local food, if we think about food security, into that space. But the biggest driver that still remains in the chain are these increased energy costs, and not only the fuel costs, but actually electricity. In last year's food inflation, where we saw rapid rise in energy costs on top of increased load shedding. So what the large-scale processors did, they invested in diesel generators, which are really driving the cost of food processing. And this is one of the key reasons why we see higher food inflation. The long-term solution, which we see, is that the stakeholders and the processors are gradually moving, in some cases very fast, investing in diesel generators and alternative solutions like solar, battery. These are all expensive capital investments. Smaller processors and smaller producers don't have the capital to engage in that. So currently, if we continue along this line of load shedding, we'll see that the larger operations will actually gain market share, and you'll have smaller operations actually losing traction in the market because they don't have the capital to invest in these renewables and the energy sources that are actually available to these operators.
There are many examples of countries getting it right. Scotland, Costa Rica, Iceland and Uruguay all produce over 97% of their energy needs with renewables, by simply using their natural resources and utilizing technological innovations that have been in existence for more than 100 years. Closer to home, the reality is that the South African agricultural sector, including producers and processors, cannot rely on traditional resources and local governments. The solution to this problem lies in their own hands. Can we find the power to change?
I think it's important to kick off today's discussion with the understanding that we all know there's a very complex political backdrop to the energy crisis in South Africa. That's not what we're here to discuss today. We know that Minister of Public Enterprises Pravin Gordhan is reporting to Scopa today. We know there have been numerous allegations of corruption, of inconsistent management principles. We know the backdrop against which the energy crisis in South Africa plays out. But the agricultural sector needs solutions, and we need them now. In many countries where social instability has surfaced, that is as a direct result of food insecurity. So the agriculture sector plays an incredibly important role in keeping South Africa together, making sure that everyone has food, affordable food, and energy plays a major role in making sure that happens. So we've put together an incredibly knowledgeable panel today to try and get to some of those solutions for you. So sitting to my left is Cor Kramwinkel. He's a partner at Weber Wenzel, specifically dealing with tax practices, and we know tax incentives in this market play an important role in trying to get those solutions to be accessible to farmers. To his left is Eugene Boyson. He's the CEO of the Cape Town Stock Exchange, and financing of energy projects, renewable energy projects, is such an incredibly important role as well in terms of making renewables accessible to agriculture. To his left needs no introduction, Mr. Jan Oberholzer, Executive Project Director now for Eskom, and we're very glad that they have taken you on for another term and that you are part of the solutions. To Mr. Oberholzer's left is Nico Liebenberg, a producer, also a non-executive director of Senves, but a farmer himself producing incredibly high-quality produce, and we're excited to get your first-hand take on some of the challenges that many producers face. And to Nico's left is Rudy Dix. He works in the presidency. He's specifically involved with NECOM. That's the National Energy Crisis Committee in the presidency. Thank you very much to all of you for your participation in this discussion. We've only got an hour and 15 minutes, and I think everyone will agree that that's a short time to try and look at all the complexities. So we're going to try and move through them as simply and as quickly as possible. I've got a load of notes on my lap because a lot of these issues are just way above my head. I've been trying to understand a lot of the complexities myself, like many South Africans have, and there's so much terminology. It's so dense. And some of the solutions and the impacts on agriculture are very specific. So if I'm paging around like a madwoman, please excuse me. I'm trying to find my feet in this mess, as we all are. I'd like to start off with you, Niku. From a producer's perspective, if you could give us a sense of what your energy challenges are, the kind of solutions you've already put in place, and the limitations on those solutions.
Yeah, so we traditionally we were farming only intensive crops. We have dry land, but we didn't farm them ourselves. We were farming intensive crops, vegetables specifically, on the irrigation, and as well irrigating maize, etc. on the irrigation. So what we started off, because of the high cost of the input in the intensive crops, we started off by putting in generators. So our whole business can run on generators. From irrigation to the packhouse to delivery to the DC in Johannesburg. But if we run all our generators for 8 hours a day, which it's the current rate that we have to run them at, it will cost us around about 1.5 million a month. So it's not viable to keep on planting the traditional cash crops for us. So we have generators. We're now concentrating only on the high-value crops to irrigate them, to reduce the irrigation hours, but the pack house runs and the generator runs permanently. Now we even have a backup generator on standby for if something goes wrong. So it's been huge investments in generators because of the way our business is built. We had to invest in the generators first. Now we're going for the solar panel solution, which will make it cheaper, and then we might start thinking of planting the cash crops again, the maize under irrigation. But up until then, we won't plant any wheat or any maize under irrigation until the problem is solved.
And for you, solar, is that a viable option? Is it cost effective?
Extremely, much more cost effective than the generators. We only put in the generators for security, but it's much more viable. So, and we've been looking for the solution for a long time. I've had 5, 6, 7 quotes, and a month ago I got to the people that I think are going to do it, because they're following the sun. And many people say you can't do it. I've seen it in Kimberley's area. They follow the sun, and you increase you follow the sun 45 degrees from the east to the west.
Okay.
And you increase your daylight sun hours from 6 to 7 up to 10 to 11 hours.
And the capex to invest initially, because it might be cost effective and you're going to get return on investment down the line because you're increasing your productivity.
Yeah.
But what does it take to invest in a big enough solution to run your operation?
Yeah, in theory, if I can summarize it, around about 100 kVA will cost you around about R1 million. It's not an exact number, but if you have a 250 kVA a transformer on your farm, you'll probably have to invest 2.5 million, and you'll not have electricity for battery system as well, but at least you're going to be able to generate the electricity for the day. So it's around about R1 million per 100 kVA.
Okay.
Can I just say that one limitation we have there is all of us, and that stopped me until I got this. I pronk now met 'n ander man se vere, but because he told me, you buy a R7 million tractor and you work it for 3 months, and then you're happy if it can stay, if you can keep it standing still for 9 months. So you're actually not using your capital. Now we all want to go grid tie because we don't want to lose the extra energy we generate. But if you go grid tied, and Jan will have to clear that for us, you can only do a solar capacity 75% of your transformer. So now, if you have a 100 kVA transformer, you can only do 75% of that, 75 kVA grid tied. So and then there's a lot of paperwork and if you go off grid, you can do the whole 100 kVA. So now many farmers would keep myself. I kept on trying to do the paperwork and everything because I don't want to lose the excess energy. But I'm just going to go off grid. I'm going to lose the energy like I use the interest on the tractor, because then we're going to do it much faster as long as it's smaller than what is Ramaphosa's beperking or
Jan, perhaps I can come to you there, and if you can give us input on that specific challenge that clearly many farmers will face as well.
Currently, we're looking at the challenge that we do have. Do we have a solution yet? No, we don't. But we're actively working on to see how we can accommodate, our colleagues, the farmers. So I don't want to, at this point in time, say something that we're currently working on, and it may not be factual yet. So, but I can just give you the assurance that we as Eskom are aware of the challenges that we have, and we're actively working on that. And hopefully we will get to a solution very soon, I trust.
Yeah, because I think when the farmers can grid tie, will stabilize the grid, help stabilize the grid. Absolutely. But now I'm going off grid because I can't wait.
Yeah.
So it's a win-win situation.
Absolutely, and that has a negative impact on the grid in any case.
Yeah.
I understand. Yeah.
While we're talking about the grid, I think that the question on many people's lips, given the stages of load shedding that we are at the moment, given a lot of talk out there, given instability, continuous failures of units, I think everyone, not just the agricultural sector, wants to know what's the likelihood of a grid collapse. I know Eskom is doing everything it can to prevent that.
is a question for me.
Yes.
I wouldn't say, it will never happen. But the likelihood of it happening that we go into a blackout situation is very remote. This is a reason why we at any time have a reserve of 2,200 megawatts. Our system operator makes sure there's always a reserve of 2,200 megawatts. So as soon as the capacity is not sufficient to deal with the demand, take into account that 2,200 megawatts is therefore as a reserve, then the load shedding stage is increased. That is to deal with the grid, to make sure the integrity of the grid is never compromised. For the last 2 years, when I was the Chief Operating Officer in Eskom, every 3 weeks we got together. We established what we call a Black Start steering committee, which I chaired. And that was to make sure that should we get into a situation that we do have a blackout, is how do we make sure we get the grid back as soon as possible. So if and when, and I trust it will never happen, we get to a stage that we have a blackout, at least we are ready to get the grid back to where it's supposed to be. But I can assure all of us, and I read all this rubbish now in the news of I don't know where this crystal ball is coming from, that the first week in June we're going to have a blackout. I suppose you read that as well. Now, I cannot believe that people can be so irresponsible making comments and statements like that and just, make everybody uncomfortable. I can assure all of us, we have, if not the best, one of the best system operators in the world. The utilities in the world, and I'm very blessed that I'm a director on EPRI, and 3 times a year we get together as utilities, and those utilities are coming to South Africa, to Eskom, to System Op, to come and learn how do you manage and how do you run and how do you make sure the integrity of the system is at all times not compromised. So whenever we do have challenges, our system operator will do the responsible thing, and that is, if it's needed, we will go up the stages of load shedding. So I'd like to assure all of us, we really have people that know exactly what they're doing. It will be very uncomfortable for all of us, but then you need to know, whenever there's immediate, like 2 days ago, we immediately jumped from 3 to 6. And that was to make sure the system is not compromised. That integrity is not compromised. So rather, reduce the demand than to have any negative impact on the
Okay.
grid.
I'm going to come to you, Cor and Eugene, for a little bit more context on the financial side and on the incentives that are in place already in a moment. But Rudy, we know that the costs of production have increased drastically. I pulled some figures. Agri-SA says 56% of farmers experienced a loss of income due to load shedding. That is easy to understand. 75% of farmers had to change production practices. 39 reduced their crop yields, and 31% reduced the amount of livestock purely to cope with the costs. So food security is a big thing. Food inflation at the moment is hitting consumers very hard. Consumers are unable to absorb the increased costs of production, but on the other end of the spectrum, producers cannot absorb them either. So somewhere in between, we have to find a way, and it seems that solution or that part of the intervention falls at government's door to try and assist consumers and farmers in making sure that people have access to stable supply of affordable food.
No, absolutely, Anneli. I think that's important, but you have to think of it as a number of combination of events. I mean, you're right. I mean, so the excess of cost in pricing of electricity in excess of 200% since this crisis had started. Heavy intensive users have seen a significant jump. As a result, many energy intensive users had to close operations or move outside. Every single industry has been affected by it, including agriculture. So we would have to do a number of set of interventions. But energy is only one part of it, right? Remember, there's an unfortunate war that is happening in Europe, Eastern Europe.
So it's
and
input costs and
so
all of that as well.
Input costs, particularly on fertilizer prices, input costs, particularly on, those are significant exporters of staple foods, but also the issues of fuel, right? So fuel and input costs has also makes it. And Nico's point about alternative sources of energy, and I think I like the point that he makes, which is, you can look at alternative sources of energy, but it's unsustainable to burn diesel. And you just look at the price per kilowatt hour. That's determined, right? Relative to what Jan produces per kilowatt hour, and we could use any price, and let's just use the wholesale price, which is, I think, Jan, about 80. What?
5 rand kilowatt.
No, that's for diesel, yes.
Yeah, sorry, what did you say?
For diesel, I was talking about your wholesale price.
At what you rand, a little bit more than a rand.
It's now about 1 rand 3 cents, right? Versus what you pay for diesel per kilowatt hour, which is
5 rand.
5 and 6 rand, So these, so you significantly see if Nico's burning diesel 8 hours a day, it's unsustainable. It's not possible. It's the same thing for Jan. When Jan has to, for example, make decisions around whether he, if he's moving to 5 and 6, do I burn the OCGTs, the open cycle gas turbines? Do I go to Ankerlig? Do I go to Garikwa and burn those things? And the bill is quite expensive, right? We're talking about not 1 million, we're talking about 2.5 billion rand a month of burning that. If you're looking at the, burning it at the load factor, basically at the rate of when you burn it, which is about 15 to 20%. So there are a number of factors that I think is there, and I think we need to do a set of interventions. I think the most important part is that I think from an energy point of view, I think the announcements by the Minister of Finance around the tax incentives to move off the grid and look at options of renewable are important. And I think there are a couple of that's going to be quite critical. From our point of view, in terms of food security and support for farmers, I think again there's a constant engagement with the system operator and the team at Eskom at what point in time do we need to look at whether we can exempt agricultural production, right, so that we are able to have that food security.
That's not an option right now, though.
Yeah, no, it's not an option. It's still being discussed. I think it's a matter that is being considered. There's many other industries that are looking at that. So I think there's a whole set of different interventions that we do require, and we have to support industry to be able to make that happen. I mean, Annelie, I want to stay away by saying we're going to do subsidies, we're going to provide input vouchers, we're going to do a whole set of different things. I think there's a whole set of interventions that support industry that are important across the industrial sectors, that is supported by the department, that is supported by DTIC. There's a whole set of other interventions also, including, for example, grants and the SRD grant that has been there to ensure that people who are required to meet food needs have some form of basic income. So there's a whole set of different things, but I think the point of this conversation is to show that you try and help Nico as a producer to develop more sustainable interventions. And it's quite interesting because I think Jan and I know this. I mean, when we opened up the private sector market space for self-generation or embedded generation, right, there was a significant uptake from miners, industrial users, retailers, property developers, but a relatively small uptake from farmers, right? Because I think these industries had planned well in advance and have already said, look, we can't rely on Eskom. We have to create and invest. It does require, of course, deep pockets because that's the kind of thing. But I think what's important is that we've tweaked it to allow, for example, one or more off-takers. So a generator that invests in building a plant. Let's just say 100 megawatt plant, right, which is utility scale, quite large, right? Before, what would happen is that generator that would manufacture that plant and dispatch electrons across the grid would generally only have given it to one off-taker. But the design of the system and the rules now have changed that allows for one or more off-takers. So it becomes slightly more cheaper when you disaggregate it and allow for many off-takers to be able to benefit from a huge capital outlay, but you're able to recover that cost not from one off-taker, but many off-takers going forward. So I think, I think that these are the kind of examples and the work that we're doing to be able to support them going forward.
Okay.
And I do think it does require for us to have a better emphasis. Sorry for the long.
No, all good. I want to come to you now, Cord, because Rudy mentioned those tax incentives. Are they enough of an incentive to really make it accessible?
Yeah, so let's start with the position before the announcements earlier this year by the Minister of Finance. So for the agricultural industry, if you were to have done a renewable, solar or hydro or whatever it may have been, then in line with the general tax principles, you would have been allowed to depreciate that equipment, so effectively claim it back from tax over a 3-year period, so 50, 30, 20. What the Minister announced earlier this year, and the draft legislation has been published, is that when you invest, and it's not industry specific, it's for business. If you invest and become the owner of renewable energy equipment, and it's not only solar, I know we're speaking a lot about the solar, but it's not only the solar, then you are eligible for a first-year deduction of the total cost. In addition, you get 25% extra, so a totality of 125%. Now, that's much better than where we were. It still speaks to the point that those with the capital can do the investment, because the needle hasn't shifted on. You're not going to go from what I couldn't afford it without the tax incentive, and now with the tax incentive I can afford it. It's very helpful. If we compare it with global trends, if we look to Australia, US, South Africa is very much in a similar space insofar as what that incentives look like. Some of the more developing nations up north in Africa, we do have examples where those exemptions or incentives go beyond income tax and carry or also cover the totality of the cost cycle, so import duties, VAT, inbound debt funding, etc. So you do have examples of countries that provide a little bit of a greater incentive, but I think purely with the tax hat on, we're in a reasonable space.
And in Africa, apparently there are agriculture-specific incentives, where the incentives in South Africa at the moment are aimed, like you said, broadly at business. Would that be a better option here? Would it make a considerable difference?
I don't think no is the answer. The reason for that is the incentive covers agriculture in any event. Okay. And I think our problem is we're in a different space country-wise than with the countries that's got an agricultural specific incentive. Those incentives are not dramatically better, even though they're only for an industry. And for us, our totality of the economy, yes, we incentivize agriculture, but if we don't incentivize the rest of the value chain, I think the problem still remains. Okay. So it, for me, seems sensible, considering where we are, to have a business-wide incentive. The incentive, there was also, just for completeness, there was an incentive announced for private use, but that incentive is much, much less attractive, and we don't have to go into the technicalities, but that only covers parts of a solar system. Yes. Whereas the business one really is all-encompassing and provides a proper incentive.
Okay. So we're talking to, in terms of the tax incentives, to those large-scale enterprises that can already afford an alternative solution. And I think we have to acknowledge that they are probably the privileged few. Perhaps financial cushioning allows them to make immediate decisions for the sustainability of their operation. But that large chunk of the middle and lower sort of end of the spectrum of income farmers just simply don't have easy access. And then we need to look very closely at projects where we draw in investment to make that accessible. And that's the space that you play in, Eugene. Perhaps you can give us some insights into where we are with providing a framework where we can make this kind of technology really more easily accessible so people can continue to produce.
Yeah, so when we think about the problem, we think about the problem of energy. We all fall into the trap of thinking about it just around the generation components and what it means. We don't think about it, what it means in terms of energy mix. It's not just the problems we're having at Eskom. If we look at ourselves relative to even some of the developed nations like Germany, we're so far behind in terms of photovoltaic generation for our electricity mix and the dynamic. So when we focused on the problem for energy and how do we get it into the hands of SMEs, who are the real catalyzers of the economy, you've got to think about the problem in terms of what's the future going to do, what are we going to derive in the future out of it, and what are those future trends that are playing out into that space. And that allows you to almost ignore the dynamic that been created by Eskom, by government, in terms of how they've managed our current energy mix. So if we think about the key trends that are happening right now, decarbonisation sitting at number one, driven by the UN in terms of the sustainability goals, which South Africa is committed to in terms of its zero emissions by 2050. The second bit that's driving it is digitisation in energy markets. And digitisation, not just from what it means around artificial intelligence, efficiency gains, leveraging robotics, leveraging machinery, but also what technology is doing in terms of driving technology, the demand for energy to drive our robotic processes and technology. And then thirdly, and this is really important for farming, is what's happening in terms of decentralisation of not just energy, but most of our markets. Decentralisation of water, decentralisation of sanitation, decentralisation of sewage. And that's one of probably the bigger trends that we all appear to be missing in this dynamic. 3 years of, I'm going to call it lockdown. If anyone hasn't begun to work from home and begun to decentralise their businesses, their practices, and how they're thinking about it, you're not going to be able to solve the future energy crisis. And we have to get to the point where we're not dealing with public-private partnership, but we're dealing with private-private partnerships in terms of how we generate the energy we require at source and forgo the need to have to transport our energy in terms of Eskom infrastructure. So it's mining houses teaming up with farmers, teaming up with other private enterprises in their localities and generating their underlying energy demand. That allows you to add even a greater efficiency dynamic in terms of what it costs to generate that energy at a unit labor cost. And then the fourth one, which no one appears to discuss in the mix, but is really important around the baseload capacity, is the ability to store electricity. And if we can't establish a greenfields industry that's able to generate storage capacity for the energy we create during non-baseload capacity times, we're never going to get the right energy mix in place. So how do you do it? The other big megatrend is we've seen globally the world commit to sustainability goals. And we have to begin to decimate our public and our private policy in terms of how we meet those underlying sustainability goals. And the only way we're going to meet them in terms of the energy mix is a transition to underlying renewable energy. Now, if we stop thinking about the problem of energy as an Eskom problem, and we start thinking about it as a problem, how does South Africa in 10 years shift itself into sustainable energy? We don't even have to bring Eskom into the discussion. You just have to bring yourself into the discussion on how you can go and grow out your photovoltaic capacity, any other types of renewable capacity like wind, even leveraging alternative sources related to gas if you're able to generate it at source. You then begin to solve the problem and get the mixes right. So we've cottoned on to a couple of key trends. So the ESG trend related to financing is becoming more and more apparent. You may dismiss it to some extent as a woke initiative, but it's not. It's a genuine attempt to generate a level of alternative resources and shift us away from a centralized form of energy creation, sewage creation, etc., and move ourselves towards much more sustainable environments for ourselves, and if not for ourselves, then think about what it means for the future generation. If we get that mix right, and we tap into that sustainable finance objectives, we can generally lower the cost of finance, which is what all SMEs require to get this energy mix correct. So the only way we can do it, sorry, my mouth's a bit dry, the only way we get it right is ultimately by tapping into these larger pools of finance. So government's already as part of its 2050 initiatives, not just that they committed to net zero emissions, they actually committed to, I think by 2030, establishing USD 8 billion of ESG financing capability for us to reach those 2050 targets. And the only way you're going to be able to access those is by structuring your SME requirements as farmers into your cooperatives and creating larger cooperative lending facilities that you can deploy against your underlying finance initiatives. And together with that, there's two components to it. It's one where you commit yourself to a certain level of KPIs around what you want to do around your energy transition, and it's also around what you deploy your use of capital related to those underlying energy initiatives. Farmers also mustn't lose sight of the fact there's three components to ESG. Energy is just one of those components. You already satisfy a second component, and you already meet the deliverables and the requirements related to it, especially related to what you're able to do around social upliftment, what you're able to do around food security. You're already meeting, I think, 6 to 7 of the 17 United Nations sustainable development goals. And then thirdly is you've already set up the cooperative structures that can provide the right level of governance associated to these factors. All three of those measures, what you do around renewable energy, what you do around governance, and what you do around social upliftment, allow for you to get discounted rates in terms of how you structure your capex requirements or your financing requirements. And the easiest way to do it is to structure it with the exchanges. Most of them have committed to sustainable stock exchanges initiatives. Most of them provide you with the underlying reporting capability that's required, and also give you the capability that we're able to go and pool capital to fund the smaller SMEs, which we bracket the underlying farming community within.
So farmers need to tap into those ESG credentials to get access to financing to make these things available.
They're already undertaking them.
Okay.
They're just not getting credit for it.
Okay.
And it's larger corporates who are establishing the credit for it. So the mining companies didn't just get into it because they were doing for better good. There was a commercial-driven rationale to go and establish renewable energy. But they very quickly all established green bonds, whether it's for the rehabilitation of dams, whether it's for underlying renewable energy creation, removing themselves from grids. They established those underlying KPIs, and they reduced their cost of funding. It's just easier for them to access those funding markets because they come with larger tranches of capital demand. And the international investors, the supranationals, like the IDCs, like the international, require larger tranches of debt for them to participate.
Okay.
They're not going to participate in small million rand loans.
Yeah, and I saw you nodding throughout Eugene's answer there, specifically around the energy mix. I want to speak specifically about what happened in Frankfurt with the Mafube municipality. And Eskom has an issue with that. And in the article I read, it said that Eskom is opposed to Mafube municipality using its own separately sourced energy because it would encourage customers throughout the country who have additional embedded generation capacity to claim similar relief. I think to some, that seems like a shining example of something where you can take literally power back in your own hands and try and find a solution, but there are issues with it. Can you explain those to us?
I don't have all the detail, but why I shook my head in agreement to what Eugene was saying is too many people are just talking about renewables, not fully understanding what they're actually talking about. I believe what is critical, and I'll get back to your question just now, I believe what is critical is that we need, the Department of Minerals and Energy need to be coming forward with an integrated resource plan, an IRP, that is absolutely dynamic and is agile. And it takes into consideration what is the demand going to be in the next year, next 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, up to 50 years. And then to fully understand, and also the profile during the day. So it's not only what is the demand, but also what is the profile and how is it going to change. So it is critical that this crystal ball is quite clear in terms of what the demand is going to be in the future. And then to make sure where are we going to get the electrons to satisfy this demand. That is not in place currently. And what Eugene is saying is so factual and so true. It is not only renewables. It is a hybrid solution that is required to deal with that demand and with a profile. And here, it is existing coal, it is gas, it is nuclear, it is hydrogen, it is solar, it's batteries, etc. Because I was listening when Nico was talking earlier, about the solar, but it only satisfies your needs when the sun shines. So what happens then when you need power during the night? So this is where the batteries are coming from. So I cannot agree more that the solution that we require in the country is a hybrid solution, but it needs to be based, and the foundation needs to be on an IRP that is really based on a crystal ball that we will change and adapt all the time as we move forward. Now, what we also need to understand is Eskom's 2035 plan, the generation plan, is saying that over the next 13 to 15 years, of the existing 40,000, approximately 40,000 megawatts, 40 gigawatts of coal-fired nameplate capacity that we have, half of that will shut down. And that is capacity. It's not energy. It is capacity that I'm talking about. And this is why it's critical that this IRP needs to take note of what is going to transpire in terms of existing capacity, what is required in time to come, and then to make sure that there's a proper match. So what does this mean to the country? And also I've heard earlier that it is not an Eskom problem, and I cannot agree with this more. What we have currently is not an Eskom problem. Eskom has a lot to fix, make no mistake. But this is a South African challenge that we're sitting with, and we all need to work together to solve this. Now, I will follow up on the Frankfurt issue. That was your question. Now, we have been vocal in the time that I was the Chief Operating Officer and the previous Group Chief Executive, that we welcome any electrons that is available that we need to harvest it. You know, when I did my MBL, I was talking about it last night in another forum. My first year, there was a prof talking about all resources are scarce. Now, I didn't know what this guy was talking about. But believe me, today I understand. And if there are electrons that we can harvest where we are now, we need to harvest it. And I believe maybe that article was not fully stating the real facts and what Eskom is striving for. We are fully aware that Eskom will be a player in the future, not the player as we have been. I'm saying to my generation colleagues, you know, especially the power station managers, if you need to understand that in future, in time to come, if your power station is not profitable, not sustainable, and not competitive, you've got no business at all. You need to understand if your unit, one of your units of your power station is not generating electrons, as a business, you're making losses. And if you say a unit will come back and it doesn't come back, as we have the situation currently, and this is very irritating, those electrons are not generated, so there's no income. So I cannot emphasize enough to my colleagues within Eskom, and we're cognizant of the fact that we will be a player, but one player in time to come, generating electrons. So I find it very strange that there is an article saying that Eskom has a problem to harvest any electrons that is available, because this is what the country needs now. Another issue, and that's a debate of, for another time perhaps, solving the existing crisis that we have. We need additional capacity. But additional capacity is going to take time, provided we harvest what is available. But the issue of demand-side management, that nobody is talking about. But if we want to actively deal, in my view, with the existing challenge, it is to look at what is available out there that we can utilize. How can we make sure this high demand is coming down? And to get additional generation capacity that we can really get quickly onto the grid as soon as possible. So I will really follow up on that one, but really this is not the way in Eskom that we see it. Yeah. Where we find ourselves currently, if there are electrons available, we need to harvest it. Because it really doesn't matter, because it's to the benefit of the economy of this country and 61 million people. Yeah. So there's no doubt about it.
Rudy, would you like to comment on that
I want
first?
to just, maybe Jan is busy fixing the generation unit, so I've been following up on this Frankfurt matter. And I think the context is misconstrued, and I think this is the problem. So let's first emphasize Jan's point, because I think from a National Energy Crisis Committee perspective and this perspective from government, who works quite closely with Eskom, is that we need to get as much as possible capacity onto the grid. You know? At any point in time, there's a shortage between 5,000 and 7,000 megawatts, right? So if you talk about planning and what we need to do, we need to fill that gap first, right? And then think about what the demand looks like going in the future, including what Eugene talks about, which is our decarbonization commitments and our national determined contributions by 2030, which means that we have committed to lower our emissions, right? And what that means. So there's a whole conversation that we need to do around a planning perspective, including the current debate, Annalie, about whether one extends the life of existing coal power or delay decommissioning, let me put it that way, rather delay decommissioning for another 2 or 3 more years to allow for us where there are power stations that have the ability to churn out energy, you know. And there are a few of them that, that would have to come into decommissioning in the next year or so, but are performing fairly well, right? Krill, one of them, for example. Camden, another one, for example, right? So I think it's quite important. The Frankfurt matter, I think, is been misunderstood partly because there are lots of municipalities that have entered into agreements with private producers. They have that. Cape Town is a good example. Ekurhuleni is another example. There are many of them. But what Frankfurt wants, what the municipality wanted, was to be excluded from the load shedding schedule on the basis of signing an agreement with the producer that could generate up to a maximum capacity of 200 megawatts. So this is PV, this is photovoltaic. Now, of course, the question was also, okay, so, you know, you want to be exempted, you want to produce 200, but it's variable, right? You don't have storage capacity, you don't have battery, you don't have hydro, you don't have pump storage capacity. So, of course, you know, at certain points in time, you're not going to get 200. And I think that's really the heart of the debate that, you know, municipality was asking, okay, we've got this PPA, please exempt us. You know, we will control our load shedding schedules. That will be chaos, right, if we do that. Because I think this is the reason. So, I mean, I think the municipality should have learned from how Cape Town does. Cape Town has a lot of power purchase agreements with private sector, utilities. They accept what the system operator gives to them and say, you need to reduce your demand by an X volume, right? But if you know that Cape Town, for instance, would say that although national stage of load shedding is 4, we are 3, because we then utilize that spare capacity at any particular point in time, right? So it keeps to what the system operator says. You have to reduce it by 4,000 megawatts, just 4 stages of load shedding. And because they have the private sector support through a PPA, they're able to reduce it by another. So I think it's quite important to understand it in that context. It's not the context of not wanting private sector. We've created that space for private sector embedded generations. That's why we have, I mean, we're tracking 9 gigawatts. That's 9,000 megawatts of private sector embedded generation. Eugene and them in the financial sector are creating amazing kind of financial packages and financing arrangements to be able to support that, right? And this is quite important. So we've opened up that space. We are saying to the private sector, invest, use your credentials that you have, as Eugene had eloquently expressed, get access to finance, get your grid connection sorted out. Jan has to sort out the grid connections and grid tying, because I think this is a major problem. Our system hasn't been designed for that, you know. So I mean, what the grid connection unit used to deal with for many, many years, up until we made this change, is, you know, a big generator coming on, you know, connecting it, taking their time, and suddenly you have a queue of about 104 projects, right? And so you had to first deal with the capacity constraints that are there in the grid connection unit. You had to deal with complexing financing and models, and you had to deal with technical constraints that wasn't necessarily there. So I do think it's important that it's not misconstrued that we are trying to promote as much megawatts. Doesn't matter where it comes from, right? Doesn't matter where it comes from. And I think that's important for us to be able to clarify the Frankfurt matter.
I think also, just before I hand over to you, Eugene, everyone's saying that things are changing very rapidly. And I think we've got to keep in mind that the overarching theme for this year's Nation in Conversation discussions is change, the power to change, adaptability. When things don't quite happen as we foresee they would have, how do we adapt to still cope? And I think we're very much aware that we're in sort of survival mode, and that while we're in survival mode, trying to make the best of the current situation and to try and work our way through the crisis, simultaneously we're planning for the future, for this dynamic energy mix, for, you know, reaching those sustainable development goals. Eugene, yes.
Yeah, I don't want to let Rudy off the hook too quickly. I think there's a significant role for government to play, and I think it's one where they've been significantly lax. The only way we can accelerate the change in energy mix and the change in renewables is to deregulate in terms of that underlying industry. And one of the big problems that was created with Eskom is not dissimilar to the problem we went through in 2008 with banks, right? Eskom were just too big to fail. We ended up with an entity that was playing too big a role in terms of our energy dynamic. And I'm always likened to Nassim Taleb, who structured coined the phrase anti-fragile. And in terms of that, as soon as you end up with something that's too big to fail, you put a vulnerability into the system, and you end up feeling the repercussions we have. And the only way to overcome it is to create underlying robust energy mix. And the only way we get that right is to have a federalized energy mix. So I'm going to use the example of the failure you spoke about. My government's response to that shouldn't have been, no, you can't do it. I would have rather their response was, you can do it, but we're not giving you anything during baseload. So if you want to put on your 200 megawatts and you want to run your engine, well, you go and figure out how you're going to solve your baseload capacity problem as well. Why? Because the sooner we have entrepreneurs, private sector, working on solutions for that, and the more we have working on that, without having to worry about the regulatory repercussions, the sooner we'll begin to figure out what's going to work for us. The only way innovation happens is through experimentation on smaller scale projects, etc. And the only way you get that right is to deregulate. Okay. If you want an industry to go fast, just ask the taxi industry. Okay. Deregulated. They deregulated themselves. They just said, I'm not listening to any of the rules. Yeah. And what happened? It accelerated at a rapid pace. Okay. Now, and I think therein lies the lesson for government. You have to gradually begin to loosen these apron strings.
We've got to start sort of coming to those solutions wrapping. I want to give you, Niku, an opportunity to ask. You're a producer, you're an example of the kind of challenges that everyone, all the farmers out there are facing. If you have a question for anyone on the panel to try and make your situation easier or better, what would it be?
See, farmers are decentralized, so you usually don't have all your farms around one spot. So in my case, I have to go and put up some panels on this farm and that farm and that farm next to the generator, which makes it difficult because you're constrained with this nasty 75% of your transformer capacity, which is then you go off grid, so you actually lose the electrons that you over-generate, because I want to do at least what my transformer's capacity is. So I've already asked that question. The bothering thing is the rules should be less stringent and quicker, because there are many farmers sitting here. They will do that, but they all been hindered by that 75% capacity that you can put in because of when you want to grid tie. And you want to grid tie because you want to use your extra electricity on this farm, on the other one, in theory. And you want to work together with Eskom.
So who makes those rules? Perhaps you can tell us, Rudy, why it's there.
No, but this is what I was saying earlier on. You've understood what I was trying to say around the open up the space. And Eugenius, maybe Eugene needs to track and find out a little bit more around how we've taken the decisions to deregulate, the word that he uses, but allowing for private sector investments to take place, let alone the restructuring we're doing around Eskom that allows for an independent system operator, that allows for them to buy on the day-ahead market and to do a whole lot of planning work. That's the main thing. But for example, why would it be, I would say to Nico, why would each and every farmer want to build generation capacity? Right? Because the system allows you to develop at utility scale large generation capacity. Let's use PV as an example. Now, if it is that it's quite decentralized, isn't it then useful to think about it as an economy of scale? And because there is no threshold for how much private sector could produce, don't you think that at an economies of scale where you decentralize, because that's exactly what's happening, you're having a decentralized system, right, introduced into a utility scale. Allow them to produce that and dispatch those electrons to a whole set of different small-scale farmers. So you're able to then deal with the upfront capex cost, which is quite huge. I can understand that, right? It's very, very difficult for a mine to spend 2.5 billion rand to build a 100-megawatt plant. They have those deep pockets. An agriculture producer does not have that. But think about it in very different ways, and this is the kind of thing that the financial incentives. Think about it at the utility scale, that where you can have many off-takers, and these off-takers are farmers that are able to utilize those electrons to assist them in their manufacturing, to run the pump storage, to run the irrigation systems.
Who would have those deep pockets?
Well, I think that's the kind of
farmers
conversation.
clubbing together?
I think that's the conversations that the association should have around how we should do that. And I mean, I think that it would be useful perhaps for us to even be part of that kind of conversation so we could link them up to those in the financial markets to be able
Well, luckily
to
we
support
have you here at NAMPU,
No,
so I
I'm
think
just
we're
saying, I
going to
think
steal
that-
you
but I
and
think
take you to a
this
bunch
is
of the
precisely why I think it's
organizations.
important.
Is that then, are you talking about a private grid between a group of farmers?
Absolutely.
Independent of ESCOM?
No, well, you would need to decide whether you want it to be off-grid or grid-tied, right? You could have either way. Doesn't matter. But the point is you could use private generation, the rules that are there, to produce a grid system, invest in that, and have off-takers, many off-takers that are there. So you don't, I mean, I think it would be significantly costly for individual farmers, medium-sized, small-scale farmers, all to do their own generation capacity, right? And I think there are opportunities in the system that allows for it to be across the system, that looks at it. And then, of course, you don't take responsibility for that capex, because this is the thing. You could have a generator who basically sells it off. They manufacture the plant, they dispatch it. You are the end user. You're simply buying the electrons. You're not buying the capex or anything else.
I'm going to give...
Just on it, I think it's quite important for Nico, because this really is probably the biggest pain point of the financing component. If you do not have the ability to reticulate your excess capacity into the grid, it becomes very expensive to get that financing off the ground for a small producer. So we can't ignore it. It's not just a matter of setting up a microgrid and then setting up billing arrangements where farmers bill between each other. The easiest way to accelerate this financing component for SMEs is if they are able to reticulate excess capacity, if they don't go and waste those electrons, if they do push them back into the grid and someone else can use them and someone else uses it through that billing engine. I think that's probably why the important discussion is currently around ESCOM. ESCOM's got two components. It's got the energy generation components, and it's what it owns in terms of the grid and the billing capacity around people. And I do think a big improvement they could make is by creating those access points and those reticulation points for micro-energy generation to reticulate back into the grid. We'll add gigawatts at the fastest possible pace if we're able to do that. And we'll also be able to improve the financing costs and the return on capital on that capital investment you make related to solar. And I think that's the lens you've got to look at that conundrum.
But you need to fix up the technical aspects, and I think Jan's team and the Grid Connection team must do that. Because I think Eugene's point is quite critical. But that is a solution that I think farmers should work on.
I think the problem that ESCOM has that we don't think about is the lines. The overhead lines. They're not built for pushing back that much electricity into the system. I think because they're built for the traditional way of bringing the electricity down to the farmers.
Yeah, Nico, that's a critical point that you're making. With ESCOM reducing the baseload capacity and renewables and other forms of hybrid solutions are developed and will generate electrons in time to come. We do not have the electrical networks where it's going to happen. So the point that you make is critical. So we talk currently about load shedding, but if we don't deal now immediately to make sure, deal with the situation and the solutions to make sure that we're going to have grids where electrons are going to be generated in future, even on farms, we're going to have a bigger problem. Yeah. Okay. There's no doubt in my mind. So it's a critical point that you're making.
Can I give you, Cord, an opportunity to perhaps, we're going to ask some questions from our audience shortly so we can get to a point of wrapping up. But I feel we've neglected you from a tax perspective here. What are we missing in this discussion? Perhaps things that farmers could leverage on in terms of tax and structuring?
Yeah, I think we've spoken about the tax incentive, and that's a very sharp knife, but it doesn't cut very wide. So that's, of course, something that needs to get attention, but the decision, yes, no, comes back to can you afford it, and is there a different solution? I know in the market there's the solutions where you effectively rent a system and you've got your cost. That's a different option. You don't have as attractive tax options, but it could be commercially the viable one. As we pay attention to this particular tax incentive, so as is common in agriculture, make sure that you've got efficiency throughout your income statement and your balance statement. So don't just look at the electricity incentive. Make sure your whole farming operation, including your personal planning, is in order, and you don't have leakage. The example earlier of the tractor, it's no good we take 125% deduction in year one on my investment in renewable energies, but I lose that benefit through other inefficiency, be it the manner I finance my operations, etc., etc. So not new to the farmer, but think holistically about this problem.
I think what crises teach us is that in order to survive, you really have to look at every aspect, whether it's your household, whether it's a business, whether it's a huge corporate entity, to manage those efficiencies and to get the kind of productivity at every level to make sure that where the crisis and where the pressure points are, you don't have as much pressure.
The good news with the tax thing is you can do something today, right now. You don't need somebody's approval. You can make it happen. So that's within your control. You don't need to submit forms.
I think that's a nice to have. That's not going to motivate you
as
a farmer to do it. But it's very nice to have once you've done it. But it's not going to be the motivation for the solar plant or whatever it might be.
Let's take some questions from our audience. If you could raise your hand if you have a question for us, and then we'll get a roving mic to you so that we can all hear you. I think there is a question at the back there. There we go. Yes, if you could kick us off, sir.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm a farmer, and there's on my side there's a problem with the balance of cost. You must remember, when I generate my own power, it's my cost and my cost alone, because I'm a price taker. I don't make the price. The other side of the coin is the consumer. That is the two bleeding sides in this challenge at the moment, because I must take what they give me and the consumer must pay what they ask him. And in between the product I'm producing, there's about 110 to 180% difference between what I get and what the consumer must pay. And that is our challenge at the moment. And maybe just a last comment. Isn't Eskom the last SOE with a little bit of milk left to harvest?
Maybe we can have a stab at that, because you look at underlying energy cost and net unit cost of electricity over the last 10 years, right? It's easy to blame geopolitical factors and Ukraine, gas costs going up, etc. It definitely plays a role, and we've definitely seen input costs go up specifically as a result of burning inefficient fossil fuels to generate the energy shortfall. So that has been a driver in it. But I think a bigger driver has been actual inefficiencies in energy production. And that's not just around how effectively we burn coal. There have been no reductions in Eskom's wage count. Right, so I'm sorry, if you were generating 27 gigs and now you're generating 18 gigs and you're still carrying the same cost base, energy costs had to go up. And so unfortunately, inflation's driven by net unit labor cost or net unit production cost. So I don't think enough focus has been on what we can do around reducing that net cost of electricity. If you're generating half the energy you're generating 10 years ago, you better be damn sure you'd be generating that on half your underlying labor cost or half your underlying operating cost, etc. So I do think that is one of the biggest ones. And if we do the comparatives around what is the underlying net cost of fossil fuels on a global basis relative to South Africa, there I don't necessarily think they're underperforming significantly. We have seen quite a significant pickup in terms of us catching up over there. But I do think we're seeing quite a significant lag in terms of what we are able to generate solar and photovoltaic at. There I think we have significant problems. The fiscal response as well is not all about, it shouldn't all be about incentives. Incentives are a little bit like, sweeteners. They're there, but it's not sugar, right? So I think we need to look at what it means around importing tax incentives, around importing photovoltaic, what we're doing about battery generation, how about actually setting up our own companies to generate and make the photovoltaic. All of those are much bigger incentives and have a much bigger impact on the underlying price components. And then everything related to alternative energy production, I'm sorry, should be zero rated on that. So I think those are the initiatives, and that's where the targeted approach has been. It's been quite annoying that we've seen no response related to the underlying Eskom, labour cost, wage negotiations, etc. It's a pragmatic discussion that has to happen. It's not sustainable, and it's not sustainable around our financing obligations for Eskom.
Another question in the front here. Thank you, Dieter.
Thank you. My question might be a bit too much on farm level, but you're speaking a lot about those who have deep pockets, but looking at farmers who cannot afford solutions. Is there an investigation into these type of farmers? They say, boer maak 'n plan. On farm level, farmers who are coming up with initiatives and solutions that we might not even know about. Are there people looking into that? And if so, do you know of examples of farmers that are coming up with solutions?
Rudy, perhaps you can
No,
give
no,
us some insights there.
I mean, I think this is really not, I mean, this is probably, I don't have an answer for that. I mean, I don't think we've really looked at it. I mean, what we looked at is across the aggregate, right, the economy. And there are interesting solutions on decentralization. And the quickest fix solution is what Nico does, is burning diesel, right? I mean, these are the kind of things, because it's immediate, it's there, it's not variable, it burns. It's bloody expensive, right? That's what you're talking about. So, I mean, I think it would be interesting, as you say, to think about whether there are alternative solutions that are there. I mean, one looks at the mining guys, and the mining guys are having grid-tied, hybrid, running PV, a little bit of wind where they're able to do that. Anglo, for example, has been looking at storage facilities, hydro, and that Sasol's been looking at gas. So there's a combination of different kind of things, but these are all high-end capex, So I think that the cheapest is to look at, how can we get additional wind, PV, and battery with that, right? And I think that's the kind of solution. And how do we create economies of scale that just doesn't benefit one farmer, but benefits a whole set of different farmers within a particular, agricultural zone? And I come back to that point. And I think that is probably a useful thing that we should think at. I mean, unfortunately, farmers are at the mercy of Eskom because they rely on them, right? So I do think it's something that we need to investigate and try and do. And so, of course, all these interventions are trying to get, firstly, to look at alternatives, because I think the question that the issue that Jan raises, we've been saying that you can't, the conversation is not an Eskom problem. The conversation is about how do we get energy onto the grid, and whether we could explore various options that are there to be able to ensure that it does happen. And therefore, we've taken decisions around how we change the market space, how we allow for greater private sector participation into this. Private sector is quite good at some of this things, right? I mean, let me just use one example. I mean, we ran the public procurement program, which is the REAP program. That's the Renewable Energy Power Producer Program. We've ran that from 2010, right? And it was quite nice, because what the banks got and what they got guaranteed, right? They got a guarantee from Treasury. They got an offtake for 20 years from Eskom. And so, of course, it becomes a cash cow. And suddenly, when we introduced the changes to the legislation to allow for private sector participation, the banks and producers and off-takers were looking at one another like this. Oh, gosh, we don't have these guarantees any longer. We have to get into a conversation on shorter-term PPAs. We have to look at some of the efficiencies that are not gained as a result of the public procurement program. So I think there are lots of options that has allowed us to be able to look at that. The point that we made, Jan and I make early on, is what we need to explore is all manner of options that can get more electrons onto the grid, and how we can assist industry, agriculture, small-scale farmers, and a whole set of different industry players that are there. Another example, for example, for the SMMEs. I mean, you may recall during COVID we had this bounce-back scheme. We were trying to support at low interest cost to small-scale farmers. We're now looking at it with National Treasury of trying to repurpose it slightly, that you could have low-cost borrowing to SMMEs to install, renewable energy, PV most likely. So again, we need to look at all the kind of mechanisms that's at our disposal, and utilizing, policy and incentives and various pockets of interventions that can support us to be able to get alternative energy. We can't rely on Eskom, sorry. I shouldn't be saying that, but that is exactly how it is. We're trying to create a market space that allows us for private sector to compete. Eskom will also compete with that. That's part of the reform program that we do.
I think if I can throw a question here into you, Jan, in terms of timing, because a lot of people are sensitive to timing in their business, obviously, especially with the seasonality of farming. But I think given the challenges that we face, a lot of people are asking themselves, do I bite the bullet now? Or do I wait a little bit for newer or perhaps a different mix of solutions to come into play? And what's your advice to them?
I'll answer it this way. We have a current real challenge in terms of available capacity. Now, if you look at, there's about 4,500 megawatts. That's 5 stages of load shedding that we're dealing with now. And it's not units that broke down, and we can fix it and bring it back. If you take Kusile, the 3 units at Kusile, we've got to build new smokestacks, and then we can connect it. So that's only at the end of the year. So those are 3 units at 700 megawatts. Then there's another unit, unit number 5, that we had the fire in the gas air heater. That's only coming back at the end of the year. Then you have Medupi 4, the explosion in the generator. That's only coming back towards the end of the latter part of the next calendar year. And then Koeberg 1 and 2, we're getting ready to extend the life by 20 years, so we replace the steam generators. So those are 1,000 megawatts. So it's 4,500 megawatts. That's not going to be available this year. And let's take it down. Let's take Medupi and let's take Koeberg out. So it is about 3,000 megawatts that is not going to be available between now and the end of the year. So that's a reality that we need to take note of. So we cannot wish it away. Over and above that, we have a fleet, a coal fleet, that is relatively old in Eskom, not maintained, no midlife refurbishment, and so that's a challenge. So it's unreliable and unpredictable. So it falls over when you don't expect it. And because the demand is this high and what we have available is down here, there's a gap. These units, we don't have the luxury to take them off and fix them properly. If it's necessary for this unit to be taken off for 6 months and fix it properly, we don't have the luxury because this unit needs to run because that's where the demand is. And it's been run in the red the whole time. So you've got an old car, you haven't looked after it, you just put in fuel and some water and you pump the tires. And when you get in that car, it is foot on the pedal. So one day it's going to stop. When it stops, you don't know why it stopped, how long it's going to stand, what does it need to fix it, how long it's going to run. So this is what we have. Now, taking that into consideration, I believe the situation will improve drastically by the beginning of the new calendar year because we'll have some units back. Then we will also, in the meantime, put some additional capacity on the grid. Now, and then what I said earlier, the issue of demand-side management. I don't believe there's sufficient attention on demand-side management, energy efficiency, etc., to deal with the current crisis. So I believe the current crisis, if you ask Jan, is going to be there for the next 12 months at least. So if you can bite the bullet for the next 12 months, that's a decision that you need to make. However, the challenge that we have in the country is there's no understanding, in my view, that we need additional capacity the day before yesterday. I've been asking for this for the last 3.5 years. It doesn't help if you say, Eskom, you have 47,000 megawatts installed capacity. The country only needs 34 in the winter months. So just sort yourself out, and we've got more than enough capacity. Life doesn't work that way. So we need to get additional capacity on the grid as soon as possible. Wherever these electrons are available, that's what we need to do. I also believe that there's not sufficient urgency to put gas-fired power plant in place. That takes you 18 to 24 months. So really, my view is, although we talk a lot, I don't see real movement from where I'm sitting that there needs to be real urgency. I don't see it. So we are going, in my view, have a difficult 12 months to 18 months to come.
Just to be clear, Jan, where does that urgency need to come from?
I think SA Inc. Yeah. SA Inc. It's not an Eskom problem.
No.
You know, everybody's saying, Eskom, why don't you build power plant? Now, businessmen and women sitting here, if you have a debt of 400 billion, how are you going to build some more stuff?
Yeah.
How do you do that?
They can't even do transmission.
Transmission lines.
The lady asked a question around, what about me, right? And where does the structure at your point in time? So the energy mix, what Eskom can do, all of that's interesting. Why do we focus on renewables and photovoltaic? If Eskom want to go out and build a nuclear power station, well, 20 years we'll still be talking about it. And even if we get the money to do it, I can promise you it's going to run over 10 times the cost we expect in 20 years from now, and we'll have pilfered 40% of the coffers. If we wanted to go do a coal-fired, we've seen what happens and how long it took with Medupi, etc. If you want to do photovoltaic, it's almost. You know, it gets delivered, it's in place, and you're getting power at some point in time. So you asked what's been done, and are there some examples? And I think that's a good question. A year ago, we did a 1.2 billion bond issue for Capital Harvest. All the underlying beneficiaries of that funding were farmers. Most of it related to specifically refrigeration, improvements in efficiency related to that, mainly for apple farming, but also a host of other efficiency gains, not necessarily energy related. We're going to issue a 300 million equity issue now in 2 weeks' time. All the beneficiaries under that are farmers. All of it relates to renewable energy. The only way we can effectively distribute CapEx or funding down to farmers is if you're able to pool your propositions. And I think your cooperatives now have a meaningful role to play again, right? Just as they went and structured underlying machinery financing, fertilizer financing, everything related to seed acquisition, etc. I think they've now got a role to play in terms of pooling yourselves. So think of a model, and I'll just put it out there. Think of a model where your cooperatives go out and build out, you know, 1 gigawatt of photovoltaic capacity, leveraging each of your farms. And as opposed to you providing the underlying rooftop capability and whatever else, you in turn agree to buy that energy from them for a period of 10 years. And they go structure the financing arrangement at the cooperative level. That's what it means to microgrid, and that's the shortest way for you to control the process and to get that underlying finance into the hands of the people who need it. And I think that's the level of thinking we need in terms of solving this problem. Just doing it as syndicated loans with big industry, with sponsors, with advisors is not the way. We need to get yourselves involved. And I think it's at that point you begin to understand what those solutions are and just what it is you can do.
So we need to start thinking a lot bigger. Instead of thinking of a solution for me and my challenges, we need to start thinking of collective solutions.
But I think the more decentralized those farms are, the more expensive it becomes. In the series where the farms are close by and high energy users, it's a bit more easy than maybe in our area or if you're a cattle farmer.
Yeah. We've got to start wrapping up. So last word from you, Rudy.
The last one. I mean, I think it's important. So I just slightly diverge from what Jan is saying. I mean, you know, so you can wait for Eskom to fix its plant and get the performance right. But if you think of yourselves as an agricultural sector, and where a large chunk of this goes into the export markets and into the, let me use the EU markets, for example. If you're not thinking about decarbonization, then you're going to have a challenge to access those EU markets. Right? And this is the carbon border tax adjustment, right? Which is going to be quite important. And many farmers know already. So the EU has already introduced it. So they're going to measure your carbon intensity in the way you do beef, cattle, the way you produce your apples, the way you do your fruits or any other harvest. And the way that you have to do that, of course, is to show that you are investing, right? Or you are purchasing your energy from renewable sources. And I think it's quite important to think about that. So put aside what Jan says or what we're going to say around when we're going to, I mean, everybody wants to know when we're going to end load shedding, right? I mean, it's like, how long is a stick, right? I mean, I think there are lots of variables that requires that. But nothing stops farmers from investing in renewable capacity and being able to ensure that the carbon intensity in the production of their produce is lessened, which means they have access to some of the bigger markets that will purchase from them.
Right, so this is a conversation that is ongoing. Unfortunately, we do have to wrap it there. We've already run over time. I know there must be more questions from the audience. Like I said, this is going to be something we talk about again and again throughout the next coming years as we continue to try and find a balance between not only solutions to the immediate problem, but long-term solutions where we put ourselves in a better position to face a future that's going to be even more demanding. If we think there are challenges now, those challenges will continue evolving. They will continue putting us all under pressure. And I think agriculturalists feel that pressure very much at a grondvlak. So thank you for everything that everyone in the agriculture sector does for South Africa. Thank you very much for your contributions, for the roles that you play in trying to find solutions. And we'll continue the discussion offline. Thank you.
Thank you.
And a big round of applause. Thank you.